So shalom, and welcome to the second program in our new Talking Memory series, Crafting Heritage, the Art of Holocaust Remembrance, a homage to David Friedman. The subject of today's program is artistic representations of the plight of the elderly in Terezin, 1942 to 1944, with guest speaker Liz Elsby. My name is Medin Shachar, and I work at the Ghetto Fighters House as an educator and a guide. I want to welcome our global audience, including friends and colleagues from Holocaust museums, institutions, and centers, Jewish heritage institutions, academics, and students from universities, and historians. Of course, our many friends who attend our Talking Memory series as well. A special welcome, as always, to the survivors and their families that are with us today. And once again, we want to thank everyone for their support and interest in our programs. This program is in partnership with the Jewish Historical Institute, the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Classrooms Without Borders, and today with Bet Terezin in Israel. And now, it is an honor to invite Tammy Kinberg, Director of Bet Terezin, to give the opening remarks for today's program that will focus on the Terezin Ghetto. Tammy?
Thank you very much, Medin. First of all, a few words about Beit Terezin to those of you who are not familiar with the institution. So Beit Terezin, or Theresienstadt, was established by survivors of the ghetto in the 70s in Kibbutz Givat Chaim, Ichud, which is, I can say, in the middle of the way between Haifa and Tel Aviv. And the founders decided to build the place in the kibbutz. That was, the kibbutz itself was founded in the 30s because the founders of the kibbutz came from Czechoslovakia and Austria. So their families, some of them were sent to Theresienstadt Ghetto. Some of the survivors after the war came and became members of the kibbutz. And the kibbutz felt that it was his duty to remember and build this memorial for the families and the friends who did not survive. But in their foundation scroll, they wrote that they decided to build a house for the dead in a place that is full of life. The kibbutz is, they're all children all around and people who cultivate the land, and they saw it as I would say, to emphasize the eternity of the people of Israel, to connect between the past and the future, to build a bridge to the future. So you can see behind me part of the exhibition of Beit Terezin, and we are concentrating on the story of the ghetto. The idea is to focus on the spiritual life, on the way that they try to keep moral values in a reality that is impossible. And this is what the survivors wrote in this foundation scroll. This was the things that they want to emphasize. Beit Terezin also has an archive, small but very interesting. And I'm really honored to be here today in such a series, a homage for David Friedman, because we have 36 portraits that he drew in our archive. And this is really something very special. People who were part of them were the leadership of the ghetto, the Jewish leadership, and it's really very interesting. Liz is going to talk today about the old people in the ghetto, and some of the drawings are part of our archive. And this is really a very special and unique topic because Theresienstadt was the only ghetto that survived until the end of the war. And when it was liberated on the 8th of May, there were about 5,000 people above the age of 60 in the ghetto, some of them 90 years old even. And this is really a unique case or phenomena in the historiography of the Holocaust. And I guess Liz will talk more about it, but I think this is something that is very special to this ghetto. Sometimes it's also called a camp because it was there were a few things that differentiated from other ghettos. And the old people in the ghetto is a subject that is very interesting. Just one more fact. Last month of 1942, almost half of the population in the ghetto was above the age of 60. And that meant that when the leadership had to send, were forced to send transports to the east, they had to send young people because the old people were protected from transport. And the situation was that there weren't enough people to take care of the old people and to work in the ghetto. So it's really something very that influenced a lot the life in the ghetto, and I believe Liz will talk about it. So again, I'm glad to be here, and I'm sure this will be a very interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tammy. And now I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker today and dear friend, Liz Elsby. Liz was born in New York City and raised in Houston, Texas. She immigrated to Israel in 1984 and served for 2 years as an illustrator and graphic designer in the Israeli Defense Forces Education Corps. In 1991, she earned her Bachelor of Design degree from the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design in Jerusalem. Liz worked for many years as a freelance graphic designer, illustrator, and artist. In 2006, led by her lifelong interest in the Holocaust and pre-war Eastern European Jewry, Liz began working for Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Today, she is, as a museum guide and graphic designer. I don't know how I can fit all of your different qualities and talents into one small introduction. Today, she is a Holocaust educator par excellence, lecturer, and a guide to Jewish sites in Poland, Berlin, and Prague. Liz is currently writing and illustrating a children's book about pre-war Jewish culture in Krakow, one of many which she hopes to create in the coming years. And the floor is yours, my dear.
Oh, I'm all bashful now after that introduction. Thank you. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm thrilled to see everyone. So first of all, thank you so much. And Tammy, thank you so much for your introduction. I really am quite fascinated by this aspect of Terezin. I'm fascinated by Terezin in general, which is strange because my family is originally from Grodno and we don't have any connection to Czechoslovakia. But since for almost 20 years, I've been totally fascinated by this subject and especially the artists. Because as an artist, how I see the world, I see mirrored through their artwork, how they express themselves, how they dealt with what they went through art, through the drawn image is something I can relate to. And hopefully I can help you to relate to it in that way as well. So I'm just going to begin with this quick quote, which I think really really fits into what artists were able to accomplish in the Holocaust, in Terezin, and especially with this group of people who, as Anna Hayakova wrote in her new book, The Last Ghetto, there's almost no documentation from them, from the elderly people who were murdered, who vanished, elderly people from Germany, from Austria, who were taken there in 1942 and didn't really leave anything behind. Art kind of gives them back their humanity, gives them back their face. And I'm going to begin with a drawing that really touched me very deeply. And the drawing was by David Friedman, whose daughter Miriam is here with us today. And this is Miriam's grandmother. And when we see how the artist rendered this face of his mother, and I can tell you as an artist, when you draw a portrait, if you feel a real connection with the person, your pencil is almost like caressing the eyes and the nose and the mouth as you create your drawing. And I see so much love expressed through this piece of work and this woman. And I wondered about her. What kind of person was she? Miriam was graceful and was nice enough to send me a little bit of information about her, what we know. And her father said, regarding my mother, she made a likable impression, and people who knew her had told me that she was called a beauty in her younger years. With all the people in our circle of acquaintances, she was always friendly and smiling. Everyone also liked her because of her readiness to help. And I thought, when I read those words, I have a connection with this woman. I see her, I could see that gentleness, that kindness coming through her face. And she had a very sad fate. She died of starvation in an old age home in Ostrava, I believe, Miriam, in 1939 or 1941. She was destined to be sent to Terezin, but fortunately, that was not to be her fate. Her fate was to starve to death in an old age home. And looking at her, and at least we know something about her. She has people who remember her, who loved her, who can leave some kind of testimony about her. I want to connect her to another group of people, again, who I said almost had vanished. And these are the elderly people of Germany, Austria, elderly Jews of Bohemia and Moravia, of the protectorates, whose faces we see here from passports and legal documents, travel documents from before the war. And we see people who are content, who have lived a life, who have this kind of happiness on their face. And what happens to them? And how come when I tried to look up these people, to find pictures, to find testimonies, to find something about these individuals, and the Theresian initiative has actually put up so many documents showing these people, telling us about them, I really couldn't find anything. It's as if they never really existed. And I'm going to talk about some incredible artists who, through reasons of their own, to show what really happened in the ghetto, but also to focus, and so many artists in this ghetto focus on the plight of elderly people. That includes young people who are drawing, diarists, established artists working for the art workshops or for the technical workshops, who are putting emphasis on the plight of the elderly. And the plight of the elderly is a little bit different than our narrative that most of us are used to of Terezin. We like to talk about the opera and the requiem and the children's homes and the writing. And I never saw another butterfly. And the human spirit and the cultural events. But not many people, even then, talked about what happened to elderly people. So I'm going to begin our journey through their representation in Berlin. And if you go to Große Hamburger Straße in Berlin, in front of what was once the Jewish Home of the Aged, that was opened in 1844, a very warm and loving place for the elderly members of the community to live out their last days in dignity and respect. By 1942, the Nazis had taken over this institution, and it became kind of a way station for the elderly Jews of Berlin to be sent off to Terezin. When you go there, you see this sculpture. And the sculpture doesn't satisfy me. It's very generic. We don't know who the people who were in this building were. We don't know anything about them. It doesn't really show us anything. There's a sign in front of us that tells us this was the old age home for the Jews of Berlin. And then from there, they were sent to Auschwitz and Theresienstadt. But I wanted more. I wanted to find out more about these people. And I'm going to tell you the experiences, kind of encapsulate the experiences of these German Jews who were sent here beginning in June 1942 through the eyes of Philip Mannes, who was a businessman. He was a furrier. He had lived a good life. He had 4 children. His children had left Germany by 1941, 42. His mother was actually a woman who was in the old age home. And I think he remained in Berlin when she was still alive. His children tried to get him and his wife to leave Berlin, but he remained. By 1941, 42, he was working as a slave laborer in Berlin. And in July 1942, he gets the terrible notice that he has to appear with his wife to the old age home for deportation. And there, something happens that's going to tie in with the way the Nazis begin to fool these old people, even before they get on the train to go. And what they did is they made these people kind of exchange their homes in Germany for a new home in the spa town. And Philip Mannes writes this: Theresienstadt has been described to us as a paradise, which our fortunes had been sacrificed. That's what the people had said in the small room where a table had been set up by the Jewish community. They told us the next day everything would be seized by the state and could only be saved by transferring it immediately. The community would secure these endangered assets and put them to good use. One enthusiastically signed the forms and left the room with a good feeling. So the Jews of Berlin had to kind of like sign away everything they owned on the false promise that they would be given a dwelling place of high quality in the spa town of Terezin. And this is the actual form they signed. This is a legal document, which is kind of promising them that in exchange, they will be getting a home in the spa town of Terezin. They will be getting 3 hot meals a day, laundry, there will be medical care. Sign here. And as you can see, Philip Mannes signs it. Many people sign it thinking that, you know, at least we'll get something. At least our assets aren't going to be taken away from us. And poor Philip Mannes, together with the other Jews in the old age home, and they would get enough people together. And the old age home had all the furniture removed at this point. The conditions there were terrible. There was hardly any food. And once they get enough people together for a transport, they either go through the city on a tram, as Philip Mannes did. In some cases, they had to walk through the city of Berlin. Those who were deported to the Grunewald station had to walk 7 kilometers through the city with their packages and with their bags to be shipped off. And he is sent to an old familiar friend, and that friend was the Anhalter station. Now, he comes into the station that was once, at one time, one of the main railway stations into Berlin, and now its whole character has changed. And he says, "Oh, great hall, who has seen me 1,000 times and more. Now you cast an old customer out into the unknown as a consignment, a slave, expelled from the society in which we have been allowed to live, protected by law, undisturbed. Now there are no more rights and laws, only steely power. And with the stroke of the pen, our citizenship was extinguished. We were cast out of the lives we had made for ourselves, working for 50 years. And from this train station, which is today a ruin, and when you go there, you see this ruin of the station, but you really can't quite feel sympathy that the station was destroyed, because there's a sign in the front that informs you that about 9,600 Jewish people were sent from this train station to Theresienstadt. The majority of them were elderly. Now, we're going to talk about their arrival to the spa town of Terezin, the spa town, which is actually an old garrison town, which was created in the late 1700s. Before the war, it had about 7,000 Czech non-Jewish people living there. And when the Nazis began to send the Czech Jews there in the November 1941, at the end of November 1941, the Czech Jews were the only inhabitants of this place until June 1942, when the first foreigners, the first people from outside of Bohemia and Moravia were sent, and they were the Jews from Berlin. Now, they don't arrive into the ghetto. They don't arrive on train tracks into the ghetto because they don't exist yet until 1943. Instead, they arrive to the town of Bohusovice nad Odrou, and they have to walk, as you can see from the website of how to get to Terezin. It's a 3.9 kilometer walk. It takes about an hour of walking for a young, healthy person. Now, we're talking about elderly people, some of them in their 80s, their 90s. Who have been on a train ride, who are in shock, who have had to be in these holding houses for days on end. These people are in shock, they're exhausted, and now they have to walk. Not everyone could walk, and some people simply were thrown onto trucks, onto backs, flatbed trucks, and taken to the ghetto. Now, we're going to talk about the first artist who we're going to kind of explore, and his name was Leo Haas, who was one of a group of artists who are working in the technical workshop of the camp, who make a secret kind of mission to draw the horrors of the camp at night. And these are etchings that he recreates in 1966, based almost, you know, if you could say verbatim for artwork, on sketches and drawings that he had made in the ghetto in 1942 and 1943, 44. And let's look at this picture. We talked about Philip Mannes before. We saw those people and their portraits for their passports. Look at them now. What does the artist want us to see? He shows us from an on top view these people thrown into the back of this van like garbage. We see that they are hanging out. Look at their feet. That some of them, they seem to have, they don't care what's happening to them anymore. Nobody's relating to each other. Nobody's talking to each other. Some of them are actually thrown in upside down. Some of them appear to be dead. Some of them are on stretchers. Some of them feel in another minute, the truck will go over a big bump and they'll go flying off into the night. We could see that it's raining. This is how you wouldn't even use transport valuable, packages, luggage this way in the rain because it has some value. We already are able to determine that these elderly people, when they arrive in Terezin, are going to be the lowest on the totem pole. Unless we have any idea who is responsible, unless we have any doubts, on the bottom of the drawing, we see he puts the words SS on the car. They're the ones who are responsible. They're the ones who are doing this. Another drawing by Leo Haas, 1942, we see that long trek of those who arrive in the winter, this very kind of bleak landscape, walking from Bohusovice into the camp under armed escort with dogs, with SS men, with gendarmes from the camp, from Czech gendarmes. And there's something also very interesting here. We see a V. And these first artists are really going to examine their work because they have a lot of clues for us. We saw that SS before, so we know who was the ones who are responsible for this. We'll see this V again, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And Philip Manis talks about when they arrive in the camp, they're taken to a place in English called the sluice, where they're forced to remain for a day or two. All of their luggage is taken away on the promise that it will be sent to them after they are given a place to sleep, or a place to rest, dwelling. Most of these people never see their belongings again. Anything inside of them that is worth something is stolen. And these people are completely disoriented. They're forced into this cold space, no explanation why they're here, what's going to happen to them. And artist Ferdinand Blach kind of captures that moment in this drawing, Arrival in Terezin. And let's look at it together, because we can see he put right in the middle, and our eyes come back to this again and again, this woman who's half in shadow, sitting on a bundle in the middle of the floor in a room with people sitting all around her. The colors he uses for this woman, these yellowish colors, her skin looks this unhealthy color. She looks completely disoriented. She looks like she has no feelings, no emotions anymore. Those emotions and feelings have kind of been wrung out of her. We don't see where she is. There's no point of reference. She's just stuck in this room with her little bundles and peculottes. They're holding bowls. Usually people weren't given food here. Sometimes people would take a bowl out and eat what they had brought with them. It's the beginning of this whole process of dehumanization that already began on the train and even began in the old age home for many of these Jews who came from Berlin on Große Hamburger Straße. Philip Manis said, with fearful hearts, we sat on the few narrow benches, waiting to see where our exhausted, broken bodies could finally come to rest. Now, when we talk about elderly people, we're talking also about a population that needs extra care. A lot of these people in their 80s, 70s, 90s are people who have the aches and pains and illnesses that we have as we get older. They have needs that are more direct than younger people. And to be thrown into this place when none of those things are taken into consideration was a shock. Now, very sadly, and Anna Hayekova has written about this beautifully in her new book, The Last Ghetto, there is a stratification, there is a hierarchy of the people in Terezin. The highest on the hierarchy are those who came on the two Aufbau commandos from Berlin, young Czech Jewish people. Czechs are the dominant force in the ghetto. They are at the top of the hierarchy, and under them come people from different nationalities. The lowest on the totem pole are the elderly people, especially elderly people from Berlin and Austria. Many of the young people, if they did know German is a second language for them. The children of German-speaking Jews, many Czech Jews who might have spoken German at the beginning of the 20th century, the new young generation are speaking Czech. First of all, there's a language barrier. Second of all, there's a cultural difference between the Czech Jews and the Berlin Jews. And these elderly German people arrive with a great deal of need. They're very needy. And at the point where they arrive, there's not enough housing for them. There's no place to put them. So in the first year in 1942, the place where most of these elderly people were put were in the attics. And Friedrich Friedman, another one of these amazing artists, he's one of my heroes, makes this drawing before the transport. Now, if you talk to anyone who was in Terezin, except for an 8-month grace period in 1943, the deportations are a constant fear. People live in constant fear of deportation. Some people were only in this ghetto for weeks before they were deported to other terrible places in Poland, like Treblinka, Mali Trosteniec, to Riga in Latvia. And he makes this drawing before the transport and gives us this peek into how the elderly are living in the attics. And first of all, Friedrich Friedman is a cartoonist. He doesn't need to show us something exact and precise. So you notice there's different sizes here. Doesn't that matter that one person is large and one person is smaller. But what he has shown us is every single person here, he's drawn them with such individuality. The only thing we don't know is who they were. We don't know who their names. Each one obviously had a story. Each one obviously had a face and obviously had a past. But here in the attic, you can see they're lying on the ground. There's no beds yet. There are beams here that are very, very dangerous for people who can't see well, for elderly people. We feel very uneasy looking at this drawing. At any moment, someone might fall over a beam and hurt themselves, and that's exactly what happened. We see here elderly people who are also blind, kind of wandering around the attic, lost. We see here people, families, elderly people. Here are two religious Orthodox Jews together. We see people not relating to each other, not speaking to each other, just lying there, really waiting for their turn to be deported and murdered. When we look a little closer at the drawing also, there's details here that are truly heartbreaking. This elderly woman staring off into the distance, people lying on the floor, a woman who's half naked. Some of these people lose their minds. Some of these people just completely shut down. Also remember, in these attics, there's no heat. There's no cooling air in the summer. Czech Republic can be very, very hot in the summer. In the attics, it's stifling, especially when these German Jews arrive in June. We see a woman who's beginning to undress. People lose all shame. They lose all consciousness of hiding their own bodies. And we also see, remember I told you these artists are using little hints for us to discover. We see one woman holding a clock. And Zdeněk Lederer writes about the history of Terezin. He says, when Seidel, the camp commander, was informed about the high mortality in the ghetto in 1942, he only said, "The clock ticks well," thus epitomizing the German aims in a single sentence. And when you look carefully, really look at the person here, you see a woman symbolically holding up an alarm clock. Tick, tick, ticking. Their time is coming to an end in the camp. This is a very painful thing. Thoman Brod, who left behind was in Terezin, also in the family camp, writes this: "We children would of course see them, the elderly, from time to time. Not that we would go visit them in their homes. That was something so repellent that we were disgusted, and it was also dangerous. There were bed bugs, fleas. It was simply horrible, horrible conditions. So the elderly people are shunned. People don't want to see them. People don't want to visit them. They're described as being disgusting. They're described as, these barracks are filled with all kinds of vermin anyway. And we'll see in a minute why people can, be cleaner. By the way, here's some more artwork showing the conditions in the attics. This is a drawing by Norbert Troller, who did survive. He was one of the artists who was sent. He was an architect who was actually sent to Auschwitz for being part of a group making horror propaganda. And he shows us that even the architecture of this ghetto becomes a instrument of torture. Because if the elderly people are put in the attic on the top, He writes there are 72 steps in the attic and 2 flights down. Now, at this point in 1942, the meals are served downstairs. The toilets are downstairs. The people that go and eat, to go and relieve themselves, to wash their hands, have to go down 72 steps to get downstairs. And he draws this and he shows us this elderly woman climbing the stairs. And notice the building itself is like almost like this huge awning mouth, kind of ready to devour her. The building itself has become something diabolical. To go up and down the stairs is something incredibly difficult. Many people can't manage it. And he's not the only artist who shows us. Ernst Morgenstern, who's working independently, he's not working with another group of artists, feels compelled to draw what he sees, also shows us the elderly climbing up those very, very steep steps. If anyone has ever visited Terezin, when you go into the Magdeburg barracks and go up to the 2nd floor where the exhibit of the art is, the steps are very, very steep. They're very old buildings from the 1780s, great big high ceilings, originally made for soldiers, not for frail old people to go up and down the steps. The overcrowding in the ghetto is something that in 1942 is unbelievable. And as we heard before, at this point, in 1942, I'm sorry, everyone, more than half the people in the ghetto are elderly. And we have this Peter King, who is one of the artists who's forced to make artwork for the Nazis. He's making charts. The Nazis always wanted the Jews who were working for them to make charts. And he's one of these brave Jewish artists who is drawing the horrors of the ghetto, and also secretly. He shows us the conditions, the division of ages in the ghetto. We see 0 to 15 years in October 1942, 2,761 people, 16 to 55 years, 17,715 people, over 55 years, 32,788 people in the ghetto who are over that age. And as we can see, that terrible crowded summer and fall of 1942, people are living everywhere in the ghetto. They're living in attics, they're living in shops, they're living in basements, they're living in stalls that had been used to put horses up when this was still a military camp. And they're living in shops. And I want to show you one of the artists, Haas, again, shows us this drawing. There's always an element of cynicism in all of these drawings of Jews living in a former butcher shop. And who are these people? They're mainly elderly people. And let's look at them. Here you can see it's boiling hot out. The windows of the shop have been broken open, are dangerous. Everywhere we see little pointy things that are sharp and can poke, very dangerous for elderly people. Old people sitting on the floor, squeezed in, sitting on the windowsill near the broken glass. We see here very cynically, it says in Czech, fresh meat. This was much more valuable place when it sold meat, when it sold something that people could actually eat. Now the meat in this store are elderly people who are useless, who are the lowest common denominator, who are simply stored away to die. Very, very cynical. And here we see an elderly blind man walking down the street. And as we see this, we feel very uneasy that Cain is either going to go into one of these grates and he's going to fall down, or he's going to stumble over and fall on and impale himself on one of these pieces of glass, or he's going to walk into this starving child in the street. And even here, and this is a very small detail on this drawing, when you see this child kind of mirrored in the broken glass next to him, we see a skeleton. So it's kind of this ominous, this is the fate of the people here. But again, to show these elderly people in this, living in this butcher shop, and with the windows torn off. And even here we have 2 men taking the bodies, someone who's died to bury or to take to the crematorium. We can see even though it's too hot, there's no individuality here. We don't see anyone looking at each other again. Nobody's talking to each other. No one is relating to each other. Nobody's feeling any pity for the people who are forced to live this way. These people are just hot and bothered carrying this kind of horrible looking corpse. he's not the only artist who draws this. Friedrich Friedman also draws sleeping quarters in a former shop. And we see also, here they are, the elderly people in the shop. But notice there's that V again. And the V is a secret kind of symbol of these artists, like V for victory. This is artwork that is going to show the world what's happening. It's artwork with a purpose. What happened to those elderly people from Germany? What happened to the old people in Vienna? How did the Nazis treat them? How are we forced to live in this ghetto? This is how. V, this is our active resistance. Charlotte Barsova makes this very painful drawing also, showing the overcrowding of Mr. Schauer visiting his wife in 1942. Now, look at the overcrowding here, no privacy. There's something that I always find very touching in these drawings, despite the overcrowding and the lack of privacy. And we see this in the work of an artist called Nagler as well. Look how everything is still neat. Everything is still hanging there. This is an attempt to make this as comfortable as possible, as orderly as possible. But we see this elderly couple who are literally lying on the floor on a box or a mattress. Behind them is their suitcase. And when you get close enough to the suitcase, we see that they actually have their names on it. And I'll tell you their names in a minute. Both of them were born in, it's Nathan, who was born in 1868, and Johanna, who was born in 1867. They were deported from Frankfurt to the ghetto in September 1942. 28 days later, they were deported to Treblinka and murdered. Hunger is something that affects the elderly the most. There's really not a lot of food in this ghetto, and the food has to be distributed among people according to their worth in the ghetto, if they're working or not. A decision is made to give the best food, of course, to children. Children are the hope of the future. People who work need better food. They need to sustain their bodies. And we also know that some of the food doesn't arrive to elderly people. Some of the food is stolen. Some of the food is taken for other people. The elderly people were kind of the lowest on the list. Norbert Troller talks about how desperate these poor old people were. Despite the hunger, wiped any inhibitions they may have had about openly begging for food. Whenever we would stand in line at any of the 7 kitchens with our tin bowls, we would immediately be surrounded by groups of elderly people who would humbly ask, "Are you taking your soup?" They were eager customers for the so-called lentil soup. It was a pitiful sight. And Ferdinand Bloch draws this drawing of these elderly people waiting for their food. Now, there's something very wrong here. Usually meals are something we enjoy at a table with a set place. We take our time. It's something to be enjoyed, conversation, not in Theresienstadt, not for these people, not for these elderly people. We see them waiting, supplicating with their bowls in front of them. It's almost like Oliver Twist, "Please, sir, I want some more." Their eyes on the meager amount of food that's waiting to be fed. Something very wrong about this, something unnatural. This is how you treat prisoners. This is how you treat criminals, not how you treat frail elderly people. And when we look closer at the drawings, you can see their expressions also. They're so intent on that meal. And notice how these have their own presence. This barrel full of soup and this bowl with whatever's in there, who knows, bread or potatoes, something, how it almost seems to be mocking them. There they are standing in front of them with that little ladle. And we can see that there's probably going to be thousands of people waiting in line to get food, and it's not going to be sufficient for everybody. We also know that some of these people actually get hurt going to eat. Philip Matter says something always happens when 6,000 to 8,000 people gather at some time to receive food. The elderly people fall easily, sustaining both minor and more serious cuts. They may lose consciousness or cut themselves on broken crockery. So even the act of getting this meager meal can be fraught with danger for elderly people. I've read many accounts of how gross it was. These people would come and they would ask for the soup. Nobody liked to eat this lentil soup, this kind of, it was And some people describe it as a synthetic lentil soup. You would save that for the elderly people. Czech Jews were able to get packages. Many of them had some relatives, somebody still in Bohemia and Moravia. People were able to get packages. They were able to try, and they worked. They were able to try and get a little bit more food. These elderly German and Austrian Jews were pretty much alone. Like Philip Mannes, many of them had family members who had gone to other countries, who had, gone to the United States or to, other countries. They weren't able to help their parents. They weren't able to send them. They were completely alone. And Karl Fleischmann, who was a doctor and also kind of very artist and writer and poet and an incredible man, also one of the very important doctor in the ghetto, draws the scenes of the ghetto, wasn't exactly sympathetic in some of his depictions of elderly people, but I'm going to show you a few exceptions. This one is always very touching to me because Ganda Redlich, who was the head of the children's division, the education for the children, he writes his diary, writes it in Hebrew every day except for Shabbat when he writes it in Czech, talks about how sometimes old people would just get lost, wandering around the ghetto trying to find food. And I could show you if we had to talk about younger people, that many times younger people are, kind of asked to help these people find their way. They're encouraged to maybe help elderly people. There are little organizations set up in the ghetto to try and help elderly people find their way from one place to the other. But Karl Fleischmann shows us a man who we think is probably on his way to get something to eat. We see he's sitting on a little windowsill. He's got a little bowl here. Look at how he's dressed. And many people in their accounts of Terezin talk about how these German Jews would dress so formally, even here, even in the ghetto. This is a way of trying to keep a little bit of the status they once had. But now in the ghetto, as they're starving and as their bodies are withering, notice how big the hat is. Notice how the coat is too big for him. Notice that he's sick. He's blowing his nose in this tissue. And I kind of hope that when Karl Fleischmann drew this man, he wasn't one of these people who kind of wandered around the ghetto, totally disoriented. Some of them would just sit down and collapse because they just couldn't find their way around. We're going to talk now about the sick and dying. And Vera Schiff, a young nurse, writes this: as expected, the old folks perished in droves. There was no way to improve their lot or make their dying less lonely and miserable. They were cut loose and disconnected in a place where all that mattered was who you knew. Most were shipwrecked, going down fast, like the sinking Jewish existence in Europe. And Norbert Troller draws this drawing of Jews dying of a terrible sickness called Theresienstadt, pronouncing it correctly, which is a terrible type of sickness, like a running diarrhea, enteritis. Gastric enteritis you would get from the rotten, terrible food. And even though they had very good health care in this ghetto, a lot of doctors, especially by 1943, 44, a lot of good health care, that was mainly reserved for people who could get better. And many of these elderly people, there was no hope for them. Notice that they're lying here on the floor. Notice that the thin bones have a bedpan placed under them. When some of these people had already died and their bodies were taken to the morgue, the state of the bodies, the emaciation of the bodies is a shock to some of the people who had not experienced this starving away from their eyes of the rest of the ghetto. Another terrible thing here is what happens in the worst ward of all, which is the ward for men who have urine tract sicknesses, men who have, the urinary problems. I forgot what it is, a cancer that you get of the urinary tract for men. Having a moment, I can't remember. Worst place of all in the ghetto. And Vera Schiff in the medical system, and she writes, the neighboring ward next to the internal medicine was designated for urological patients. The hall, while relatively spacious, was crammed with tightly packed cots. The ward was filled with foul odors and it looked oppressively shabby. It's really the worst place. And it's there that this artist, Marx Muller, who was an art dealer from Prague before the war, goes to work. And he does something amazing there. As he's working with these dying people who have this very painful disease, very painful condition, in a place that stinks, that's smelly, that more normal people wouldn't want to go in, he would sit and he would draw the patients. And he would draw them as human beings with dignity, not people who are dying of a terrible illness that makes them unable to control their bladders. And he would sit with them, he would hold their hands, he would talk with them, and he would draw these beautiful, sensitive portraits of them. He draws over 400 portraits in about a 9-month period in his time at Terezin. And some of them he names the people who he's drawing. Here we see Hans Kauder from Vienna, who he draws in 1944. Some of them are just elderly people who he captures. Almost all of them try to show these as people with dignity. He also shows the nursing staff who are working so diligently to try and save these people. In the last few months he's in Terezin, he just simply gives up. He can't deal with the overwhelming scenes that he's forced to witness every day, and he stops drawing. And in 1944, he was taken to Auschwitz and murdered. But what he leaves behind is such a beautiful testimony of the humanity of these people who are really considered the lost, the grossest, the lost causes, the cases that nobody wanted to deal with or see. And finally, for most of these people, what awaited them was deportation. In 1942, in the fall of 1942, almost 16,000 elderly people were deported from Theresienstadt to destinations in the east, to Treblinka and Mali Trostenitz. Most people think most of the people in Theresienstadt were deported to Auschwitz. About half of them were not. Half of them were deported to Treblinka, Mali Trostenitz, Majdanek, Riga, etc. And I'm going to talk about these deportations now. Ganda Redlich writes in his diary, a transport with elderly people will depart. Father, mother, grandfather of people who worked here for months, and this is their reward. A ghetto in Poland, a death sentence. The atmosphere is not good. Fear and despair and anger. Lambs are going to the slaughter, defenseless. And Malvis Shalik, who also was murdered in Auschwitz in 1944 for not wanting to draw the face of a here, draws this drawing of a woman who we think is about to be deported. Here she is. We don't exactly know what is going on here. We see she's an elderly woman. She's collapsed on a bed. She's exhausted. She has her shoes on. She's wearing clothing. Bundles and packages are on this bed. Apparently she's being deported somewhere. We're not sure, but it's called rest. It's very uneasy drawing also. Why is she lying on the bed with a package and a bundle? Why are people kind of ignoring this woman who's lying here? Start my video, okay. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Stop video, okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Wonderful. And this drawing by Bedřich Frita, I think is for me is one of the most powerful drawings of his work that he creates in the ghetto before he's murdered in Auschwitz in 1944. It's this pitiful woman before she's deported, this elderly woman. And again, as a cartoonist, he doesn't really care that his lighting is not exact, it's not realistic. But we see here her face is in shadow. The light here is on the star. That's her definition now. That's who she is. She's just a Jew being deported. Her hands are lying useless on her lap. Everything she owns in life, everything, all of her years of existence on the planet is now reduced to this little bundle that she's lying on. She's just in this room as if she's in an interrogation room with this light on her, and she's about to be deported. And we can see Bedřich Frita also shows a transport, people in this stormy, terrible, vision, being deported off to be murdered. And I just want to show you the ages of those who were deported from Treblinka, Theresienstadt to Treblinka in September 1942. This is a pie chart. We see 37 women age group, 46 to 60. It's a very slim part. the majority of the people on this pie chart were 1,343 women, age group 61 to 80, I can't see the thing, 85, 1,343 women. None of the Jews in this transport survived. One was a Jew of Czech citizenship, 977 were of German citizenship, and 1,100 Jews were of Austrian citizenship. And I'm going to come back now to two portraits. We began with that portrait of Miriam's grandmother, and I'm going to stop with two portraits. And one of them is this beautiful portrait by Carol Fleischman of an elderly woman. We don't know her name. But I can tell you that when I draw a portrait and when I create a face or make a portrait of someone, I have a dialogue with the eyes. And those eyes kind of look into you. It makes you almost uncomfortable as an artist. But here, the artist is having this direct dialogue with his subject. And we see this woman who is obviously elderly. Maybe in a former life, she would have been more put together. Her hair would have been put back. Her clothing would have been so disheveled. But she's looking at the artist in such a direct way, with such a pitiful look. And it kind of reaches across those 80 some odd years since it was drawn. And it speaks to me too. And I think that when we remember these elderly people, that this artwork, these people, we don't know who they are. We don't know what happened to most of them. We don't know about their lives. We don't even know their names. But through their artwork, we can remember them and kind of give them life again. And when I read that David Friedman talked about his mother and said, I was grateful. Now, she died a terrible way. She starved, but at least she was spared Theresienstadt. I'm going to go back to that last portrait, filled with so much beauty and dignity and love. And at least we know something about her. We know what kind of person she was. She has descendants who remember her and love her. And hopefully at the end of this talk, we'll be able to see and remember these elderly people from Terezin, and maybe kind of adopt them as people we want to remember. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for a fascinating presentation. I could have listened to more, of course. We do have, first of all, a lot of people are writing thank you for talking about this subject. I do have one woman especially who asked a question about ages. You did show us the pie.
Yes.
What were the elderly when we're talking about the elderly? How old were these elderly people?
That's a good question. I think it's people above the age of 60 or 65, I would say, people who couldn't really work, who had full-time work. I'm saying from 60 to 65 and above. Actually, in that chart we saw that showed the age definitions, it said 55. But I'm believing it's people who are no longer of work age. I'm going to say 60 to 65. It could be not exactly the precise number, but that's what I'm going to say.
Yeah, but that's amazing, because you think these 85-year-old elderly people are being transported from Germany, for example, sent all the way to Terezin.
Liz, if I can interrupt.
Please, thank you. Yes.
There was a definition in Ghetto, and this is already based on the German laws of pension, because people above the age of 65 were not, well, the idea of sending people to work camp was not, it wouldn't work telling that they were sent to work camp, because they were already at the age that they didn't have to work. So probably this is the reason Theresienstadt was presented to them as kind of an elderly city where they will get a place to, a home, elderly home that they will be taken care of, and so on. And in the Wannsee conference in January 1941, there was a decision that Theresienstadt ghetto will be a ghetto for elderly people. And also what it was called Judenrat in the other ghettos in Terezin was called the Ältestenrat.
Right.
And all the idea was that those old people will probably, there's a sentence that is very vague, that the problem will be solved by itself. So, you know, the people will probably die there. And they could not, yeah, they could not really tell the people that they're sending them to work camp because it didn't make any sense.
Right.
But they believe that they will die, you know. And also another thing, if I can add, is that they were not forced to work because the age of working was between 14 or 16 to the age of 65. So this was another problem because for some of them, working sometimes could save their life. So they didn't have to work. So they, as you said, Liz, they didn't get food from other sources. And if somebody who worked could get some more food, but they could not. So this was another thing that was awful about the old people in Terezin.
Yes. Thank you so much, Tammy. I was learned so much from you. So,
of course. So I'm glad that we invited Tammy to come on as well. But another question, it's connected to what Tammy was just talking about. The dealing with the elderly through art. Was this something particular to Terezin in the artwork that you saw? Because really Terezin received a large number of artists and artisans. Is it something that you noticed in particular in Terezin, or is it a phenomenon that you see in other ghettos as well, as people are living their lives and suffering, as far as artwork of the elderly?
Well, first of all, Terezin is kind of unique in the, let me just get rid of this cat.
Yeah, the cat was there for a while.
That we have so much, yes, and I did mention Malva Shalek. Someone asked me, Walter Goddard.
Just writing him, yes.
We don't have a lot of artwork from other ghettos. We do have artwork from Lodz Ghetto, and Miriam is going to give us a whole presentation about that. That's also a fascinating subject. We do have some cases of artwork from places like Kovno Ghetto and even the Warsaw Ghetto, and things that were hidden also in the Ringelblum archives. But this amount of people who drew elderly people, and again, remember, we have so much preserved from Terezin. You know, I've looked through diaries, I've looked through children's drawings, I've looked through people who weren't part of this, this particular art, the technical workshop, artists who were drawing by themselves, artists who were working. It's amazing how this really, I think Tammy said also, how people were, something very unique, that people are, there's so many elderly people here, and that almost 5,000 survived to the end of the war. By the way, most of the 35,000 Jews who died in Terezin were elderly people. Many of them who died in 1942, 1943, many of them Jews from Germany and Austria. So I think that because we don't have the same body of work that we have from Terezin, and because in Lodz Ghetto, Ramkovsky took better care of elderly people. There was more, you know, attention to them. There was more care for them. I think that it is pretty unique that so many people were moved by how many elderly people were in Terezin and their plight. Most people, however, when they write their memoirs about elderly people, wrote a few sentences, really didn't write a lot about them. And I've looked, I've really searched, and maybe Tammy can, a little bit more illuminating, but I know that even Anna Hayakova in her book, The Last Ghetto, talks about, they're kind of mentioned in passing.
Anna's here, by the way, so she could also answer if she wants to come on.
First of all,
I know. So if Yolanda wants to come on, yes.
A wonderful book, which it's just like, it's like eating delicious food every single page. Wonderful. And I learned so much from her book as well. So if she would like to add something, I would be more than happy.
Well, I'm trying to unmute Ilana, but I don't know if I can. And in the meanwhile, actually, Tali Nates is asking. Tali Nates is the director of the Johannesburg Center. She is asking to speak a little bit about the Elderstadt role in housing of the elderly, which is
wonderful, please,
unbelievable. Also the provision of food and other provisions. And is there any writing by the elderly themselves about their situation?
Well, Philip Manus wrote this amazing diary. He was on the last transport to Auschwitz in late October 1944. In the ghetto, he actually organizes lectures, hundreds of lectures. As Tommy was saying, there's some people that have a lot to do, and people above the age of 65, 70 aren't working. These lectures are a way of keeping them out of these terrible crowded conditions so they can be and listen to lectures. As things got improved in Terezin, in other words, by 1943, when most of the elderly people had either been deported or died, I forgot the exact date, but it's 33% of the ghetto, I believe in late 1943, was elderly, as opposed to 1942, which you saw from the chart from Peter Keen, which was more than half, large 60% was elderly. Also, they were able to create better conditions. What they did is they took the barracks, the attics where elderly people have been living, and they added toilets and they made them more livable. And they threw the elderly people into these homes, these houses, where they also lived in terribly crowded conditions that also didn't have adequate, plumbing. And so they were kind of squished into these houses. And you could actually see some of the artwork. Malvina Shalik, for example, someone asked about her, shows a lot of drawings of women sitting together in the little courtyards in these homes where they were living in, like in 1943, etc. So that terrible spring, summer, and fall of 1942, when the ghetto was really at its most overcrowded, and people are living in the stores and living in the stables. The decision is made, I guess they were storing people higher and higher. So the ones who came in the, before that, they were on the lower levels, and the most unbuilt, filthy, terrible places are where the elderly people were put in 1942. And again, as Anna talks about in her books, this is the main players in this is the systems that the Nazis set up to do this to these Jewish people, and how people live in extremists, and how they try and make a society in a place that's so horrible.
Yeah. There's someone asking if you know where Malka Shalik's work is, where her art is kept.
I know that you have a lot in the Ghetto, Mohammed Ghetto.
Something like that. I think there was something going on in Eilat, and a lot of them down there, and it was transferred back up. Someone is asking about Yuda Bakon, if he ever painted in Terezin or ever painted scenes from Terezin after the war.
I know he drew, I'm getting him mixed up with Peter Gintz, who also drew lots in the ghetto. Yuda Bakon, I'm not as sure, so I don't want to say something that I'm not as sure about. I know that he drew immediately after. He drew the portraits in 1945 of his father coming out the chimney, called In Memory of the Czech Transports. He draws the man who restored his faith in humanity, Petr Shimysl. I'm not going to opine on that because I know a little less. Maybe Tommy does a little, if he has artwork that survived from Terezin. I'm not sure.
I don't think so. He was a child, and I think most of his works are after the war.
Right.
I don't recall some artwork from the ghetto, but as you said, I'm also not 100% sure. But to my knowledge, all these works are after the war and not during the ghetto time.
Right. Now, there were children who created amazing artwork. Helga Vaisova, whose father told her, draw what you see, who, the events of the ghetto, the arrival of the Bialystok children that so many artists drew, she draws also. She draws elderly people. She draws elderly people. I know in Anna's book, she shows a drawing by Norbert Troller, people picking up things off the ground, like weeding through garbage, elderly people. Helga Vaisova drew that too. It's amazing how these artists in different situations are seeing the same things and drawing them. And she was one of the children who actually draws what she sees in the ghetto. Other children, have draw for publications like Ghetto, but that's a whole other story here. It's also fascinating.
Yeah. Someone just wrote, Rebecca Schiffman wrote at the beginning that she says, hello from Fred Turner. That was, that was in Terezin.
Wow.
And she just said that some of his work survived and is now in Bet Terezin. So that's
how interesting. Well, what a privilege to be able to have him here. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So wonderful. I know. These things happen and it's incredible. That's why I always say at the beginning, I never know who's going to come to the programs. I always say, first of all, thank you to the survivors that come to be with us. And there are other survivors in the audience as well from the Warsaw Ghetto and other places. So we're just so happy that they're able
to. It's always amazing when we have survivors, and you should be coming and healthy for mehr Wrestling, 120.
You know, here's a question that we get all the time. And this is a very, practical question. Where are these art supplies coming from? Because you mentioned that, of course, they're working in workshops and everything, but is most of this work hidden? I mean, there's a whole story behind, when artwork is discovered. Is it happening with the Germans watching, or is it done, when they're not watching? And where are these supplies coming from?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, some people got supplies through packages that they got. Peter Gins, for example, whose mother and his father doesn't arrive until very late, I believe until 1945, when they're sending spouses of people the Jews and the Nazis don't consider Jewish. His family was able to send him supplies, even so he could do bookbinding, etc. in the ghetto. Some of them, like Friedel-Dicke Brandeis, got supplies from non-Jewish friends who would send her. And the amazing thing is to see that kids make artwork on cardboard, pieces of paper that have things printed on them. Some of them steal the supplies when they're working in the technical workshops, stealing them. And making the artwork at night. That's the artists like Leo Haas and Frederick Fritta. Yeah. Some of them are working in another workshop where they're making like arts and crafts and paintings. They're also taking the things and stealing them. Some of them are bartering them, and in some cases, people use wrapping paper. They use whatever they could find. But, if the package came wrapped up in paper, I don't know about any of you, but my Polish grandma, every single thing was saved. Every shred of paper, if something was wrapped up in paper, it was saved. The strings were saved, rubber bands were saved. When people got packages, those papers became valuable. You could draw on them. You could give them to kids to draw on. So people are very resourceful. And those are some of the methods in this particular place, how they got these supplies. Friedel-Dicke Brandeis, by the way, when she arrived in Terezin, brings suitcase with art supplies in it and sheets to make backdrops for performances.
Wow. By the way, there is someone here that's saying that her great-grandmother, Rosa Salzer, was also sent to Theresienstadt and from Austria. She's looking for information. So, Tammy, that's you're the connection. Get in touch with Catherine. Get in touch with Bet Terezin. And see any information there. That's the best source that we have for you. Just go onto the internet. Someone else was asking about having a list of the names of the artists that you mentioned today. I'm just going to remind everybody that there is going to be a recording of this program, and we will send everyone a post-event link to the recording, and then you can see all the names of all the artists that Liz talked about today. So again, someone is asking about Ältestraat. I think we need to do another program because someone said I've never heard of them before. So we have a reason to get together again. But I do want to thank Liz once again for this incredible presentation about a subject that someone mentioned. We don't talk about the elderly, and just really giving them the respect they deserve and bringing their lives and their suffering to the forefront so that we can talk about them and remember them. I want to thank, of course, Miriam Morris, who's with us, and she also put information about her family as well.
That's her grandmother, the drawing.
It's your father and you that were the inspiration for this series, of course. And of course, Tammy Kienberg, I want to thank you again for your opening remarks and for the work you do at Terezin. And I see that there are people in the audience that will now turn to you. So there.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you.
Get information and find out more about their families through Terezin.
By the way, there's a new exhibit in Terezin, which I was very fortunate to see with a group of students recently, which is amazing. So if you're in the area, I don't know, you talk to Tammy about going and visit, it's definitely worth your time.
Definitely. Oh, we lost Liz's camera again. So I want to say shalom and thank you to everyone for coming to today's program. Please join us for the next program on June 26th. You can use the link that I put here to go and register. And we will be sending out an email tomorrow to everyone on our Ely mailing list anyway. So you'll get an invitation by email, hopefully tomorrow as well. And I want to say, wish everyone a happy and healthy day. If it's in the morning, evening, night, if it's warm or cold, we're all just very happy that you were able to join us today. Liz, thank you.
Looking forward to hearing Miriam next time.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.